Okay, thanks very much, Pat. I was asked to address the question of what openings there are for media activism in Canada, and more generally, under what conditions have people mobilized around media and communication issues. And unfortunately, there's a sort of general lack of comparative systematic research in that issue. But I think it's possible to pull out of the literature, the academic literature, some ideas on that question. And also I want to just also present you with a few of the key highlights from a survey that I did with openmedia.ca. Steve Anderson is here, who did much of the legwork on that survey, and also co-sponsored with WAC, which is an NGO concerned with communication rights for all. So I'll start with some ideas from the literature, okay? What is it that leads to, if you like, media activism and the expansion of communication rights? Well, I'll start with Michael Traber, okay, a sociologist of a theological bent, the late Michael Traber, made an argument that the expansion of communication rights has been associated historically with political revolutions, and has been, by and large, a byproduct of political revolutions when, as he put it, the people's stories are politically dominant. When people need access to the means of communication and the transformation of structures of communication in order to fulfill some other project, often of life and death significance, they're going to be involved in, if you like, transforming the processes of communication. And he identified three waves historically, looking in sort of very big picture terms of the expansion of communication rights, starting with the liberal democratic revolutions of the late 18th century in America and France, which popularized and entrenched the idea of the free expression and freedom of the press vis-a-vis the state. He then talks of a second wave associated with the socialist movements and revolutions of the 19th and 20th centuries, in which communication rights, this adds to the idea of freedom of expression, the notion that communication rights can be collective, not just individual. That, in other words, groups, entire social classes, minorities and so on, may be entitled to be able to have a voice collectively. And secondly, that the idea of freedom from state suppression is not on its own sufficient. People also need access to the means of public communication. So an expansion of the idea of communication rights. And he identifies a third wave occurring after World War II with the anti-colonial revolutions throughout what we used to call the Third World, which introduces the idea of planetary responsibilities of the media, including the need to address inequalities on a global scale. So there's some ideas from one particular writer. I'll also reference John Downing, who's done encyclopedic work on radical media around the world, arguing briefly that alternative and radical media rise at moments of political and cultural crisis and rebellion, although he wants to insist that their significance is ongoing, but they become particularly prominent at moments of rebellion, and they inform and energize social movements, and vice versa. They are informed by social movements. He sees an organic relationship. I want to quote also from Malkia Cyril, a brilliant young activist with Oakland's Youth Media Council. If you ever want to liven up your conference you're organizing, invite her to it. She argues that media misrepresentation is a life and death issue for some groups, like African Americans. She points out that media demonization of black youth in the dominant media as criminals makes it easier for police to get away with shooting unarmed African Americans. And finally, I'll draw an idea from Robert McChesney, who has argued that opportunities for fundamental change in communication policies and structures have been associated with critical junctures. That's his notion, critical junctures, which is characterized by three things. First, a disruption of established regulatory regimes, such as that introduced by new digital technology. Secondly, a crisis of legitimacy of dominant communication and political systems. And thirdly, broader currents and a climate for political and cultural change more generally. I think it's especially appropriate to refer to McChesney because he's co-founder of Free Press, which has been referred to in some of the other sessions at this conference. I can remember meetings with Dave Skinner, Dave's out there somewhere, and others, in Vancouver, right, in the early 1990s. You probably remember the good old days, Dave, when we used to get to meet in a living room or a union office with about 18 people, right, which was most of the media activists in Vancouver at that time. Well, now Free Press in the States has a paid full-time staff of that number, backed by something like nearly 500,000 supporters, right, according to his website, nearly 500,000. And that organization didn't even exist 10 years ago, right? So it's astonishing what can be achieved in a short period of time. And it's encouraging that there is an emerging parallel organization in Canada called openmedia.ca, which Steve Anderson is doing excellent work around as national coordinator. And that was founded just 3 years ago, and I think has made very impressive progress, probably as more than any other group I've been involved with in the last 25 years. And likewise, the groups that are represented at this panel, I've been familiar with the work of the Friends of Canadian Broadcasting for over 20 years, and I'm glad to see that they've been joined more recently by other groups like Cactus and Smart Change and so on. But I think we have to admit that compared to the US, Canada is not yet a seething volcano of media discontent waiting to erupt. And we're not likely to disrupt air traffic either with media activism at this point. The corporate media are not yet the kind of perceived threat or shared grievance that they are in the United States, where what you have is, a decade of state repression of citizen-run low-power FM radio during the 1990s, the virtual disappearance of local radio in the wake of the 1996 Telecommunications Act, the Federal Communication Commission's efforts to further raise the ceiling on media concentration, the arrogance of former FCC Chairman Michael Powell, of whom many stories could be told, the rapidly reactionary politics of Fox TV, the domination of talk radio by right-wing gasbags, and the perceived collusion of the US media, right, as a whole, in the Bush administration's decision to invade Iraq. So there's plenty of galvanizing issues there, right, to get a whole lot of people across the political spectrum, including in many cases on the political right, fairly ticked off with the media, and it galvanized a remarkable upsurge of media activism in the States in the past decade, including the dramatic emergence of free press, which I just noted. By comparison, Canada doesn't have any obvious catalysts for progressive media politics right now. Nothing as glaring as what I've just mentioned. Our most visible media villain, Conrad Black, someone referred to him earlier today as Prisoner Black, has been humbled by the system itself. And if we go through our survey, we did, the survey was of 75 NGOs in different sectors, progressive politics, professional service, independent media, arts, culture, gender, religion, human rights, labor, First Nations, and environment, and peace. Going through that survey, I'm just going to briefly list some of the obstacles to media activism before I conclude with the positive springboards. The obstacles would include that we don't have a single diagnosis for media shortcomings. There are some issues coming up that will bring into play conflicting interests and prescriptions like copyright. The potential components of the Media Democracy Coalition may not share the same interests on every issue. Some of the potential stakeholders for more democratic media have been relatively disengaged so far in media reform campaigns, such as the peace and environmental movements, charities which are constrained by tax rules limiting their advocacy work, and arguably individual journalists in mainstream media haven't been as involved as one might hope, although that's not true of their unions as such. I think you need to make it a bit of a distinction. Also, frankly, I think the excellent policy and advocacy of media workers' unions has sometimes been constrained by a territorial rivalry, and let me conclude with a mea culpa, that we as academic students of the media probably, and it's been argued, we have not done enough policy-relevant research that can be fed into the policy process. And also, it's no surprise that the survey shows that most NGOs perceive sustainability and financial and other resource shortages as their biggest challenges. Their financial precariousness may make them somewhat vulnerable to agendas set by funders, of which government actually turns out to be particularly prominent.